So I'm here to talk to you today about life after macOS server. The sky is falling. So that's the impression you'd get if you read a lot of the reaction that there has been to Apple's recent announcements that I'll get to in a bit, that the sky is falling and what are we going to do? And hopefully I can help you come up with some strategies about that here. My name is Ben Goodstein. I am the technical leader Apple. I have just had a job promotion. I did ask for Supreme Leader, but apparently there's some Snoke guy who already has that title. But yeah, so technical leader Apple, so I technically lead Apple's at the IT services in University of Oxford. So the University of Oxford is a world-renowned institution, and we are there to back it up with its IT. So we were #1 in the 2018 Times Higher Education World Rankings of Universities. We were also the same #1 for the preclinical in health and also for social sciences. And here in the UK, we are #1 in the UK Research Excellence Framework in 2014. They assess how well research is going in universities throughout the UK. And we got a gold rating for our teaching excellence framework. So this is the Oxford that you're probably familiar with, the familiar dreaming spires, these beautiful old sandstone buildings and that sort of thing. But it's not all about that. We don't get like #1 in research excellence just by hanging out in these old buildings and pretending to be Harry Potter. For instance, here is the Blavatnik School of Government, which promotes transparency and open forms of government from its amazing shiny new glass building in Oxford. It's the first school of its kind in the world. And here you can see the new Beeston building that physics are building. It's been designed so that the labs have ultra-low vibrations from the surrounding city so that all sorts of extremely sensitive experiments can take place in a completely neutral environment. So I'm not really here to talk about Oxford. I'm here to talk about macOS server. And I'm going to start with a little bit of its history, because just like Oxford, you can't have the current day without all the history. So if you'll bear with me, let's go back in time, way back in time, to the distant, misty past of 1999. In the beginning, there was nothing. This is what nothing looks like. Okay. This was the hardest slide to do by far. And then God said, let there be Rhapsody. And there was Rhapsody. So Rhapsody was kind of a hybrid of the macOS 8 GUI, the Platinum-style GUI, and OpenStep via NextStep. So this was the stuff at Next that Steve Jobs had been working on before he came back to Apple. Sidebar, that's why a lot of the classes that you work with in Objective-C and Swift start with NS. That's because they were NextStep previously. Exciting things happened. NetBoot was introduced in an update, and then this was finally actually released as macOS 10 Server 1.0 in 1999. Okay, so these two releases kind of came out. By the way, when your favorite release of macOS server comes up, give me a shout out. I want to know, which one really gets you pumped or quietly excited if you're British. So we start in 2001. They released Cheetah, which is kind of the first version of macOS 10 server, as it was called. And this had Aqua interface, Apache, MySQL, PHP, WebDAV, NetBoot for real this time from the beginning. And then 10.1 Puma brought QuickTime streaming server, whatever that is, I don't really remember. And the first Xserve is sold, and it's a G4. And then in 2002, 10.2 Jaguar, no, okay, came out. Open Directory was in this, based on LDAP, which was the beginning of the end for the old system that they used to use, which is called NetInfo, but they still coexist at the moment. It brings NTP, SNMP, Mail, and Samba 3. Remember when we used to have Samba in macOS server? Those were the days. 2003, we get 10.3 Panther. Ooh, Here's a fan. We have Workgroup Manager appears for the first time for you to manage your manage preferences. And then, oh, yes. Rawr. In 2005, we have 10.4 Tiger, which brings a host of things. You get access control lists, Xgrid, Spam Assassin, ClamAV, software update server, iChat, XMMPP, blogs. And it's the first time that it's a universal binary, and we see the original Intel Xserve. And then 2007, woo! Just me, okay. This is kind of when I came into the whole, sorry, I've gone too far. Oh, wait, no, don't. I've blown it too soon. Anyway, so in 2007, we get 10.5. This is when I kind of joined the Mac admining world. We get Leopard, which I could only see that the great feature in there was Radius, and that they removed Podcast Producer. Oh, and NetInfo finally went in this one. But this sold for $999 as well, which seems phenomenal when you compare it to where it is today. And then 10.6, Snow Leopard. Yes, that's better. That's better. I think we all love 10.6. It holds a special warm and fuzzy place in most people's hearts. It goes full 64-bit. New versions of everything. You get the mobile access server and reverse proxy, and it halves in price to just $499. You remember typing in a serial number when you had to install server? It seems like 8 years ago. Oh, okay. That's controversial. Controversial. Yeah. So in 2011, we get 10.7, and it's the end of a separate server OS. It's now just an app called Server 1.0. And the price crashes to $49.99. I looked all this up on Wikipedia, so I'm not sure what the British equivalent was, but probably £49.99, let's face it. And we get new versions of Calendar Server, Wiki, Mail. You can still get Server Admin and Workgroup Manager as kind of like separate downloads, but they're not kind of bundled in the same way that they were before. And Xsan is now included with Server as well. Okay, and in 2012, we get 10.8 Mountain Lion Server, which is the final goodbye to Server Admin, Server Assistant, and Server Monitor. And it's cheaper at $19.99. And this is when the caching server was first introduced. And I bet actually caching server is why a lot of people still have macOS server in their environments. And this says podcast producer gone, but I think I said that 2 slides ago, so that can't be true. I will check that out before I release the slides. Okay, 2013, we get 10.9 Maverick server. Not much love for these recent ones, I see. Developers can now download it for free. Nothing much exciting happens. They make it go all weird and silver. Some new stuff gets hidden from newbies under an advanced column. And then 2014, we get Yosemite server. Workgroup Manager finally dies completely, which is kind of forcing people towards MDM and away from MCX. And then 2015, you get 10.11 server, 5.0, 5.1. And this time, you don't have to keep buying it. So for $19.99, you're covered for all future releases of server. So basically, buy it once, forget about it, until they deprecate it completely. And it's the last supported release for the Intel Xserve. So this is the last supported release on any kind of dedicated server hardware that Apple produced. 2016, you get 10.12 server, 5.2, 5.3. It's kind of boring, just does the same, but like a few bug fixes and so on. Then 2017, you get 10.13 server. Okay, popular. So in this one, file sharing, caching server, and time machine backup destination all move into the OS. So they're all ripped out. That's kind of the major thing that happens in 2017. And then on January the 24th, 2018, the world ends. Apple announces the deprecation of much of macOS server. Okay, so what really happened is Apple posted this page to their support site talking about changes coming to macOS server in spring 2018. It details how macOS server is changing to focus more on management of computers, devices, and network storage. Which sounds pretty good, right? Because Profile Manager is pretty woeful at scale. So if they're concentrating on that, then that's got to be good. And Apple's own SMB server is I mean, this might be controversial, but I think it's the only thing that reliably talks to Mac clients over SMB. But here's the kicker. Okay, so snuck in at the same time is this cheery announcement that Apple are going to deprecate pretty much everything else the macOS server does. Some of these are only going to be likely to be lightly used out in the wild, like calendar and contacts, mail, messages, and wiki. But there's some quite big ticket items deprecated too. There's DHCP, DNS, net install. I think we've heard quite a lot about that, and therefore NetBoot. And so, of course, a lot of people's initial reaction was to panic because the sky is falling. But let's not get too ahead of ourselves just yet. First off, it's important to remember that these are going to be deprecated before they are removed. So as you can see here, does this work? It's the wrong button, no. If you've already configured one of these services, you'll still be able to use it in Spring 2018 macOS server update. So if you've already set it up, for a while at least, you're still going to be able to use it. But the new installations are going to hide all the deprecated services away from new users, and you won't be able to configure them with the server app. Some things are staying. MDM's not going anywhere. We don't know what form that will be in currently, but they've said they're going to carry on looking after device management. Open Directory is probably not going anywhere since it underpins so much of what Apple does. And file sharing seems safe too, since that's all been moved into the OS. But this prompted quite a lot of unease on things like the Mac Admin Slack and the Mac Enterprise mailing list. Here's some quotes. I like to read this one out in a really whiny voice. Just how many chances should businesses give Apple? Apologies if you are in here and you made this comment, by the way. They killed Apple Server. They killed the Xserve. Now they're making Server worthless. Oh my God, they killed Kenny. What is the compelling reason for taking away services, really? It's not like Apple can't afford to continue support. Well, I'd say this is probably down to return on investment. Let's not kid ourselves that macOS Server was ever a huge money spinner for Apple. Maintenance will be a challenge, a lot of time, and our clients will see an increase in their billing. I think this is from a consultant. And yeah, maybe for a while, but learning new stuff is always hard. And once you've learned it, sometimes you can find out you can actually get things done faster than before. And I love this one. They probably spend more resources on something trivial like what color wood the floors in the Apple Store are. This is probably true. Yeah, depending on whether you think that's trivial or not. I don't think Apple does. Yes? Do you have who said these? I don't. I am keeping them anonymous for now. Come see me later. OK, so an important bit of advice right now, if you use macOS Server, is probably just don't panic. Apple is giving you time to migrate. So these prepare for changes documentation is something that Apple's been doing quite a lot recently. Prepare for changes coming in 10.13, prepare for changes to the way MDM and DEP works. Apple is giving you time to migrate away from these services. You just need to formulate your game plan now, because they're not necessarily telling you how yet. But if you have one thing that you should probably do, if you have this thing, you should probably lose it. It's time to lose your fear of the command line. While some of the replacements for the deprecated services I'll be talking about today have a GUI, in reality, you're going to have to get used to configuring stuff from the command line, i.e. in terminal. You shouldn't fear this. One of the greatest steps you can make as an administrator, it is one of the greatest steps that you can make as an administrator, and often allows you a lot more fine-grained control over the services you want to run. Often, the GUI will give you limited buttons and switches to mask all the complexity of what's going on in the background. But this is kind of at the cost of flexibility. And you find yourself having to hand edit the configuration files the GUI produced anyway to get it to do anything particularly snazzy. So, if you're looking to replace the functionality of macOS Server, probably the first thing you need to do is think about what operating system you're going to run your services on. Firstly, you could stick with macOS. You could look into Linux or BSD. There are a lot of similarities behind the scenes with macOS, and it can have lower hardware requirements, which could make things cheaper for you. You could move over to the dark side. And at least for some of the services, you could move to using software as a service, cloud apps, where you don't even need to know the platform that you're running on. Incidentally, this list isn't exhaustive, like Solaris is still a thing, I think, at Oracle, and so there are other OSs, but these are basically the ones I think people are going to think about. So let's look at the advantages and disadvantages of each of them. So friendly, cuddly, warm, comfortable macOS. Keeping your services running on Mac has various advantages. You know it already. You've probably been working with it for years or some amount of time. Under the hood, it's all Unix. It's a BSD variant, to be precise. It was designed to serve multiple users from the ground up. Even the client is reasonably easy to get set up as a server without server.app. You can still get GUIs for some of the replacement I'm talking about today. I mean, if you're a consultant, sometimes having a GUI is a good thing because you can talk someone through, like restarting a server from over the phone if you can't get network to them or whatever. Oops. Okay. That's one of my notes. But it's true. So one of the disadvantages of running macOS is a BSD derivative, which means it's not Linux. So a lot of the stuff you'll get about the services I'm talking about today, if you go to, say, Stack Overflow or Server Fault or something like that, you'll get the Linux command for how to fix this. And they're not necessarily semantically equivalent. Like sed is a case in point. Sed has completely different options on BSD to Linux. But there is a thing called Homebrew. And Homebrew allows you to, it's kind of a port system. It allows you to compile or install pre-compiled software. A lot of the equivalent Linux tools you can install to get that same syntax. And another thing, compared to something like a Linux distribution, the packages aren't all included. So the things I'm talking about, you can't just go to Apple and say, OK, I want the latest MySQL server, the latest PHP, I want this, that. They don't maintain a repository of these things for you. So there is Homebrew for that as well. But just bear in mind that Homebrew is kind of designed for developers, really, to develop on their machine. It runs everything under the same user, even if you're running things as services. And that's not a particularly kind of intelligent way to go about running services in a secure way. And updating them can be a pain. If you download a load of packages from various sources, keeping those up to date can be a pain. Auto-package can help you there. But you may find yourself having to go out to several different places to find all these updates rather than being able to run like a single command and get them all updated. And of course, now there's no real server hardware. So the Xserve is gone. The Mac Mini server is gone. Yeah, you can put a Mac Mini in one of those Sonnet racks. Maybe you're doing that, I don't know. But really, there is no hardware that can properly speak to fiber channel storage and so on. So, the message from Apple for a long time has been they are moving away from the server platform. And this kind of thing confirms that. So let's look at the advantages for Linux BSD. Number one, it's open source. Yay, open source. What does that mean? Well, it can mean various things. One of the things it means is you can look at the code if you're so inclined to check out if it's security compliant or if it's doing what it says it's supposed to do. And you have to remember on macOS, the kernel and a lot of the tools are also open source, so you also have this benefit. So you retain that openness if you move to Linux and BSD. Doesn't mean that it's free necessarily. So there are plenty of Linux and BSD derivatives that are not free that you have to pay for support, like Red Hat Enterprise Linux. But generally, there will be a community version of that which is free. So you have like CentOS for the equivalent of Red Hat Enterprise Linux. And lots of server tools are included. So they're designed primarily for stability for server applications, these OSs. So there's a ton of software included. And and it's all going to be a lot easier to update as well. You have tools like apt in Debian and Ubuntu, which is a package manager, equivalent yum in Red Hat, DNF in Fedora. I mean, they're all like command line tools, a lot of which have GUIs as well, if you're so inclined, that allow you to keep up to date just by running a command on the command line. And that's not just the OS, it is the surrounding kind of environment of packages that come with it. It has significantly lower hardware requirements, like I said. Since you don't need things like Siri or Metal to run a server, they're not included. So you could make do with cheaper hardware, PC hardware, or even zero hardware, because you can virtualize it to your heart's content. You're not limited in the same way that you are with macOS to running two macOS VMs on macOS hardware. You can run as many VMs in Linux as you want to. So of course, it's not zero hardware, really. It's someone's hardware. There's bare metal, but less hardware, maybe. And it has a huge user base. So combined, Linux and BSD have a huge amount of people who are interested in helping you, sometimes not helping you, but there are loads of resources like I've mentioned serverfault.com before, where you can go and ask questions of seasoned Linux sysadmins or see questions that have been previously asked and get answers to them. So this is a slightly different point to before, but again, depending on which you choose, they're not completely equivalent. So if you do decide to go the BSD route, I mean, there are fewer BSD releases, but again, be careful that the commands that you read are not necessarily semantically equivalent. And there are so many flavors of Linux, especially, that it can get a bit confusing. I haven't ever done a count on how many it is, but a lot of them are to do with the differences in the GUI. But you should think about like maybe not having a GUI this time. And so there's also a steepish learning curve associated with this, especially if you're moving from macOS. I said that the community can be very helpful, but it can also be quite difficult moving from an operating system where you push a couple of buttons and flick a couple of switches and then you have a fully fledged server to one where you have to hand edit everything and run a ton of configuration files. And it's easy to break and a lot harder to fix. So when I first started running Linux at home, I can remember I wanted to get the latest window manager or something like this, and in order to get it, I'd have to install some library or deinstall some library, and I screwed my system more times than I care to remember because it is very easy. It doesn't stop you necessarily. There are things like secure Linux, SE Linux, which make it harder to do that. They're more SIP-like, but it is easy to break, and when you get your system into a bad state, it can be pretty difficult to fix. Okay. So, believe it or not, there are some advantages, possibly, to moving to a Windows server. So you possibly already have the infrastructure in place. It's not unusual for places of work these days, I've heard, to have Windows servers controlling things like directory and file services, DHCP, DNS, and the like. So maybe you can piggyback off that. Windows, of course, is a paid product, and so you get enterprise support. I have no idea what Windows enterprise support is like. I don't use Windows very much in my working life. It has a GUI. I'm saying question mark. A lot of the stuff that has a GUI in Windows for like the DNS and DHCP server, it's really just like lists of text anyway that you can right-click on maybe. I don't really call that a GUI. And then the disadvantages. It's definitely not Unix. It's definitely not Linux, and it's definitely not BSD. I know there's some like witchcraft these days with containerization that lets you run bash on Windows, but it's not Linux. So it works completely differently to Unix-based platforms, which could be frustrating when you're transitioning from one platform to the other. So also, if you're not using the built-in services on Windows like DNS server, DHCP server, and IIS for web pages, the documentation can be pretty scant. Windows sysadmins don't tend to step outside the box a lot, and they don't tend to install third-party server software to run functions like DNS and DHCP and web serving, because it's built in. So when you go down that route, you might find that there is not that much community support and documentation for doing that. It's pretty much closed source, of course, so you can't inspect the source I'm not suggesting that everyone can inspect the source, but with open source, you expect that a community is looking at that and checking it out on your behalf. There's some trust there, but you cannot do that at all with Windows. And it costs money. I know macOS server costs money as well, but it's peanuts compared to what Windows costs. And yeah, it's Windows. Like, we're not here because we love Windows, so that I count as a disadvantage as well. Okay, so you're going to need a strategy if you're going to migrate your servers away from macOS server. And if you have macOS server, you should probably start thinking about it now. Apple's given you a pretty clear timeline on when all of this stuff is going to happen. So in macOS server, it's very easy to get your server name and your DNS records all in check, because the OS will tell you if that's not right, if your FQDN is not set right and your reverse lookup is not working right, it will alert you that that's the case. You're probably not going to get that hand-holding when server app goes away, so you're going to have to figure out how to get that sort of thing right for yourself. Now, remember that currently, macOS server advertises its services with Bonjour. I mean, it doesn't have to, you can turn that off, but it does. So you can easily find, say, a calendar server on the network because it's being advertised with Bonjour. And you're probably going to have to think about how that's going to work without server app. If you install another kind of calendar and contacts server on there, how are your clients going to find it? Is it going to be by IP? Are you going to run something like Bonjour or Avahi if you're not running on? Avahi is an open source implementation of Bonjour that you can run on Linux and Windows. I'm not sure, definitely Linux. So you might need to think about that. You need to think about which services you really need. Are your users really using Wiki server, for instance? If not, then you don't have to worry about migrating it. Are they, think about what you could and couldn't do without. Also think about what you can and you can't migrate. This is something that the Apple support documentation doesn't really tell you very much about. It gives you all these alternatives, but it doesn't tell you how you're going to get your current data into these alternatives. So hopeful for some more documentation later, but it might be that you have to figure that out by yourself as well. And because, again, you're not being handheld through the whole process of setting up these servers, where Apple will generally make sane and secure choices for you and will alert you if you're doing things unsecurely with certificates and that sort of thing. You need to think about this yourself a bit more. So I'd say that you probably need to come up with a proof of concept and then test it. Test it. Test that it works exactly how you think it's going to work before you suddenly switch all your users over to something new. So now I'm just going to go through all of the services that Apple said they're deprecating, and actually going to go through the alternatives, some of which Apple came up with, some of which I've come up with, and look into how this might work. So the calendar and contact server in macOS server is and always has been open source. It's open source from the beginning. I think it was introduced in 2006, something like that. You can check the GitHub first commit if you really want to. It's on GitHub now. It's Python, so it runs pretty much anywhere. You don't have to worry about whether you're on Windows, Unix, Mac OS. If you can install Python, or if Python is already installed, then you can run calendar and contact server. It's in use as Apple, which is always kind of a good sign that something is not going to get stomped on. It's in use at Apple right now, anyway. The authors wrote Twisted, which is a networking library for Python, which any Python coder who looks at this code will generally tell you that they think that Twisted is an amazing piece of code. And not only that, that they wrote the RFCs for CalDAV and CardDAV. They wrote a lot of those RFCs. So you know they're sticking to the standards because they wrote the standards. But it's not going to be quite as simple as just dragging and drop, like installing the open source version, dragging and dropping your config over from the installed version by macOS server, and hoping for the best. I tried this as a test for this talk. It's not great. It makes a lot of assumptions. The documentation is not all there for the open source version. You're scrabbling around to find out where your database is and so on. So I don't think it's going to be, I'm hoping that there will be, like I'm hoping for a lot of these services, there will be more documentation from Apple about how you actually transition from the old school to the new school. Because right now, it's a world of pain. There is another open source server called Radicale, which was, I think, started by some guy as a fun project, and then turned into a full open source CalDAV and CardDAV server. CalDAV and CardDAV are the protocols that the server uses to create meetings and appointments and contacts, and to store those for users and have them updated. It's written in Python again, Python 3. So again, you can run it pretty much everywhere. It is easier to set up than the open source version of Calendar and Contact Server, but it makes a lot of assumptions about your needs. So you have to be careful that it doesn't just make too many assumptions about your setup and how it's going to be. And also, the migration path is unknown. So how do you get your data out of Calendar and Contact Server in macOS Server and into Radicale? That's not clear. We haven't heard anything about that yet. But of course, there are software as a service offerings, such as G Suite, which is fully cloud-based. It's world reachable. You don't have to worry about where your server is and whether you have access to it. You can get to it all anywhere on the internet. It's not free, so that's a slight disadvantage, I guess. And again, the migration path is pretty much unknown. So we don't know how we're going to get our data out of Calendar and Contacts and get it up to G Suite. There's been no, there's certainly been nothing from Apple about how you might do that. And there is also Exchange and Office 365. My email actually today is getting switched over to Office 365, which is probably why it's not working at the moment. And Apple actually called out this thing called DAVmail. Now, DAVmail, I last used. It's not a mail server. It is a gateway between Exchange and the client, and it kind of pretends to be IMAP and CardDAV and CalDAV, so that you can speak to an Exchange server. And the last time I used DAVmail, I mean, I'm not saying anything about the product, but I was using Mutt, the text email client, and I wanted to speak to my Exchange server. And in about 25 minutes, I completely deleted every email I'd ever received. So I would use DAVmail with caution. It's very powerful, but yeah. OK, so we've heard a lot about imaging. Imaging is not quite dead. It's just pining. It's just stunned. It's just pining for the fjords. It's dying. Let's face it. The fact that Apple are ripping this out of macOS server is a pretty good sign that it's being deprecated in general. The fact that you can't NetBoot an iMac Pro is a good sign. But perhaps you have like an older estate. You still need to image. I can still see there being reasons, despite all the warnings that we get about why you might need to do it under certain circumstances. NetBoot isn't magic. NetBoot is basically just DHCP options. And if you've got a DHCP server and a TFTP server and probably, I think, an HTTP share or an AFP share, is it SMB that you AFP, OK. you can do it. This is how we've been netbooting in Oxford for a while. We just have a configuration file for the ISC DHCP server, which has a load of hex in it, but we have like a Perl script that can create this hex so that the client that is netbooting can understand the configuration that it gets back from the servers. I think this was all detailed like a few years ago, but if you need to do it still, this is one way that you can do it. There's also Pipines, Briennes, software written in Python, BSD-Pi, which basically, again, it's written in Python, so you can run it on pretty much everything, and that's the whole point, was trying to get it off macOS server. There is the Jamf NetSUS appliance, which refuses to go away, and that also will provide netboot services for you as an appliance. You can run it in Docker and so on. And then you have Imager. Imager actually serves up the images. That's written in Python again. So you can place MBIs on there, and yeah, you don't need macOS server to run that. Okay, so DHCP, if you wanted to stay on macOS, it's unlikely to be deprecated. So yes, it's being ripped out from the server interface, but it's present on all the clients. So if you have a look at etc. boot pdlist.plist, you can actually see like a skeleton setup. It's off by default, and if on a running, it's off in macOS client by default, but if you turn it on in macOS server, you'll see the whole configuration there. And if you run on a copy of macOS server, if you run server admin settings DHCP, you basically get everything that it's doing, and you should be able to translate that to some other DHCP package. There are plenty of alternatives. There is a thing called Kia, which is the evolution of ISC DHCP, which is what we said that we are using in Oxford currently to netboot. There's a software called DNS mask, which is supposed to be good for smaller network environments. And you can have radius, which is possibly overkill for DHCP, but is one of the functions that it provides. And there's Windows DHCP server as well, which you may already have in your environment. You probably shouldn't be running two DHCP servers at the same time. So if you are running that at the same time, maybe don't do that. And now just look at DNS. So DNS mask, this does DNS too. So it's a pretty simple to set up. It's a lot simpler than something like bind, which is the old school DNS server of choice, but it regularly has security issues. I mean, all DNS servers do. They're a great vector for attack. But bind is traditionally known for not having particularly easy configuration. There's Power DNS, which I believe has easier configuration than bind. And again, there's Windows DNS server. So if you have a Windows machine lying around, you can, with Windows Server on it, you could get DNS running there. Don't forget, again, software or platform as a service, you can get managed DNS in the cloud as well. There's a few cloud providers that will manage your entire DNS for you. I will link to those in the links at the end. As far as mail goes, you've got some choice about mail transport agents. They're all much of a muchness. They have some of them have advantages and disadvantages. You've got Postfix, which is more modern than Exim. Is that right? I can't remember. Is like Exim newer than Postfix or I can't remember. Okay, one of them is newer than the other, and then you have Courier, which is even newer, and these are all for sending mail. And you have the old SendMail program on the OS, which is generally not recommended for actually sending mail. Although, despite the name, although most programs have to link to it in some way to actually get the mail out over SMTP. And then, of course, you've got your software as a service. So you've got Exchange, Office 365, and G Suite. Mail delivery agents, these are the things that actually get the mail into a user's inbox. Again, you've got Courier. You've got Cirrus, which I believe is what Cirrus and Dovecot are two that macOS Server has used through the years. And again, you could use Exchange, Office 365, or G Suite for mail delivery as well. Messages, I don't know how many people are using Message Server still, but you can use eJabber, which is actually what is in macOS Server right now. Mongoose IM, which is another Jabber server. I don't know much about Jabber, I've got to fully admit. Prosody, which is another Jabber server. And you can use software as a service, so move away from XMPP and Jabber completely, and look at things like Slack and Microsoft Teams. Or again, G Suite you can use Google Hangouts. VPN, you've got a choice between software and hardware VPNs. Software, I think the most popular choice is OpenVPN. We use this quite extensively at Oxford to protect our Bastion servers. Soft Ether VPN, which I hadn't heard of before Apple talked about it, but is quite an interesting thing that emulates an Ethernet switch and provides VPN that way. And they're also recommending something called TCP Crypt, but from everything I could read, the clients for TCP Crypt are not for production. So I don't know that I could recommend TCP Crypt for you rather than something like OpenVPN. And then you've got hardware, you've got Cisco routers, Cisco routers and firewalls that will give you IPsec. Zixel will give you L2TP. Juniper will also give you IPsec. So if you have some hardware lying around that can do VPN, it doesn't have to be in macOS Server. You've got some choices with web server. If you want to host it yourself, if you want to host web pages yourself, you can use Apache. It's pretty ubiquitous. It's installed on every Mac, even if it's not a server. It's pretty well documented as well. And you can get little kind of GUI packages that wrap it all up for you, and you can flick switches. So it's kind of a bit more like macOS Server. So there's MAMP, which is Mac, Apache, MySQL, and PHP, and WAMP, which is the Windows version of that. Then you've got something like Nginx, which was designed to overcome some problems with performance and scalability that Apache had. Depending on your needs, if you have greater needs, Nginx is a good one. And then you have Lightid. I can't remember. There is a pronunciation that I can never get right. Anyway, it has a small footprint. It's great for when you need to run a ton of servers concurrently. And of course, you can go out there and get your web pages hosted as well. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of providers of web hosting. And you can get a dedicated server if that's what you need, if you don't want to share with other people and share your resources with them. Finally, Wiki server. I don't know how many people are still using Wiki server. I think it is slightly more popular than you might think. It's not very glamorous, Wiki. I mean, not that any of this is particularly glamorous. But you can export in various formats. In fact, if you check out Charles Edge's Cryptid blog, he did recently tell you how you can get a lot of information out of the wiki. I will be linking to that in my slides too. But at the other end, importing is not going to be fun. Wikis all have kind of slightly different syntax. You could script it. You might end up spending more time scripting it than you would just ripping out any of the stuff and just formatting it again. So, yeah. But the various wiki servers that you could install range from MediaWiki, which is the same one that Wikipedia uses, and that's done in PHP. PMWiki, again in PHP. XWiki, which is a Java servlet. And Moin, this is Oxford's wiki of choice. We love Moin, that's Python-based. But I still have questions. I do still have questions. I want to know about these migration paths. Apple hasn't told us enough. They said, yeah, we're taking away the server. Here's what you can migrate to, but they've not told us how. So how is that all going to work? How is the integration with Open Directory going to work now in macOS Server? That's not clear. How is, say, certificates going to work? Because before, it was very easy to apply a certificate to a service. Are you going to have to take care of that all still yourself? So whilst they've answered, well, they've given us a push in the right direction, they still leave quite a few questions unanswered about the future. So do you have any questions? Yeah. Yep.
Profile manager.
Hang on a sec.
Did you mention profile manager? Sorry. Did you mention profile manager?
I did mention profile manager. They have not said, they have said that they will continue to improve the management of devices. Now, I take that to mean that something is going to be there for MDM. I kind of hope it's not profile manager. Sorry?
Something's going to be there where?
Well, there is still going to be some form of server application. So that it's like most of the services are being deprecated from it, but they are, well, who knows, they may even just hive off Profile Manager into its own thing. They've already taken the caching and the file server away, so maybe it'll just be an MDM app.
Anyone else?
Anyone else?
Yeah, just a quick comment and heads up that let's see if I got the writing right. That DNS mask is wonderful to maintain.
Okay.
And then there's, let's see, DJB DNS, which is not wonderful to maintain. So I was comparing these two, and I'm happy that I didn't stick with DJB DNS.
Okay.
It's
everything I hear.
Weird.
Yeah. Everything I hear
way.
about DNS mask is that it's easy to use. Everything I hear about pretty much every other DNS and DHCP server is it's not. So, who's next? At the back.
Back.
Yeah, just on the contact and calendar sharing.
Yep.
We recently did a migration from people using Cario, and we were looking for a solution for contacts. We usually use G Suite, but G Suite wasn't going to work on the contact side. It doesn't really work in terms of sharing. So in case anyone else is looking for either open source or commercial, we found something called SaberDAV.
Okay.
And they've got a commercial product called Frux, which is Fruux.
Okay, careful how you say that, yes. Yeah, I mean, this is by no means an exhaustive list. There are literally, there are going to be hundreds of, especially, DNS, DHCP servers out there that you could do. I'm basically giving you the ones that Apple have, but yeah, there are probably some stuff for particular environments where you have particular requirements that are going to be way easier to use. So yeah, you're going to have to do a bit of research yourselves as well.
No one else?
Anyone else?
No? Oh, no.
Graham?
Ready? Oh, stop it.
For running a web server, I imagine a lot of people run their Monkey server off a web server on a Mac Mini. Amazon's S3 in CloudFront is really cheap and really easy to get going with, and if you can make that go down, you're doing really well.
That's absolutely, yeah. And in fact, the new stuff in Monkey 3, which allows you to have your repo, based on S3, a lot easier. Definitely check that out if that's one of the things you're using macOS server for.
A little remark concerning the caching server.
Mm-hmm.
They have pulled it out of the server app and put it into High Sierra.
Yeah.
But I recently had a problem with that. Because we use a lot of virtual machines, and if you want to, if you run an High Sierra we run it in VM Fusion, it isn't there. You can't check it.
I think that's by design. As I said, like Apple are quite restrictive about virtualizing macOS anyway. You're only allowed to virtualize it up to twice on any machine. I guess there were maybe problems with running it virtualized when they looked into it. You're running it virtualized in a client that possibly is networked to the host OS that it's on. That could be also, which could be running a caching server as well. So that could get all quite confusing. But I think that is by design. I think if it detects it's in a virtualized environment, it will just switch off the server. Hi.
I don't know whether you've come across this or if anybody else has. So with caching server in High Sierra, in the client machines, has anybody come across, is it possible to deliberately point the clients at a client which is being a caching server, or is it just like peer-to-peer and whoever the hell's closest and whoever answers first?
In 10.13, I'm not sure. There is a command which you can use, which you can define.
Pretty sure it's closest.
Okay.
Yeah, I thought that might
Just
be it.
subnet and random. Okay.
Cool. Oh, again.
Okay. Yeah, I mean,
Go Cisco.
I imagine that, like, I mean, for us anyway, the only macOS server we were running was a net install and caching server. So, you know, yes, that's baked into the OS now. It is maybe not as configurable as it was before. But yeah, there are alternatives. I think, yeah, it's not just Cisco. I think there are other companies who are doing the same thing as well, especially, you know, caching for apps that are behind wireless networks, where it's important.
Cool.
Okay.
So the sky is not falling.
It didn't
Go,
fall.
Ben!
I prevented it.
Go, Ben!
Thank you.
Yes, better.
Thank you. And thank you. Thank you for bearing with me during the
Cool.
code
So-
fail earlier on. Thank you.
Next